I'd been at the Sundown Mountain Resort for about a month when I finally got that dreaded night shift. It wasn't so much the late hours that bothered me, but the stories. Everyone had their tales, which they dolloped out like spooky campfire treats. "You never know up there," they'd say with that wide-eyed look of someone who saw too much or didn't see enough. The Sundown was majestic by daylight, nestled in the cradle of rolling hills, the picturesque treat on every postcard rack in the gift shop. But overnight, it was different. Once the sunset chill crept in, it seemed to bring a shift in the resort itself, like it was yawning awake. The night I rotated in, Keith, the old-timer, handed over the keys with his usual tobacco-tinged grumble. "Make sure you do the rounds," he told me, eyes narrowed like he was trying to teach fog how to hover. "And Matt, seriously, stick to the path. Don't go trying shortcuts. Not everything here likes to be surprised." Working nights kicked off innocuous enough. I handled a few room service calls, unjammed a candy machine, and helped a lost toddler find his folks. It was around 3 a.m. when the quiet settled like a third skin, winter cold on top of my thermal. That sort of hush where your breath sounds meteoric and your sneakers scudded too loudly against smooth tile. I was doing my rounds, step by routine step, when I decided to check on the indoor pool. Sometimes drunk teens like to sneak a midnight swim. But tonight, it was empty. What wasn't empty was the scent that hit me. It was like damp wood right in the middle of a long rain. Not a pool smell. Not our pool smell anyway. The air felt denser there, pressing against my chest like I'd plunged into deep water. I shivered and rubbed at goose flesh that sprouted up my arm, my fingers brushing against the room's thermostat, which read an inexplicable 72 degrees. In a swim room, you smell chlorine or that stale body heat humidity. You wouldn't sniff mildew or, was that wet moss? I flicked the lights brighter and they hummed in consent, but corner shadows seemed to linger like slow, resigning sighs. It was then I heard it, a slap, like wet clothes thrown against tile. I swung around quick, flashlight poised, half expecting some drunk to stagger out apologizing. Nothing, just echoes of that slap bouncing off cold tile and colder water. By the office, the hours etched on, and I found strange solace in the scratchy sounds of security monitors positioned too statically to really show anything new. Yet, in the lazy sweep of the camera, a blur darted past. Probably a night critter, I thought, rationalizing fast enough to compete in mental Olympics. Still, that didn't quite explain the prickle up my spine or fix the hard lump of dread that lodged in my throat. As dawn teased the horizon with whispers of gray, I felt both relief and annoyance churning in my gut. My eyes were gritty, my mind numbed by every shadow and flicker feeding my ramped-up imagination. It was all just part of the night shift jitters, or so I muscled myself to believe. Then came that moment just as I was about to clock out, stiff and tired and smelling vaguely of antiseptic. I stopped by the front desk to drop off keys when the tingling static of the radio caught a signal. A voice, layered thick with static. "Return them." That's all it said before lapsing back into silence. I glanced at the radio, then up at the empty lobby with its cavernous ceiling and long shadows puddling beneath antique chairs. "Return what?" I muttered to myself, frustration mingling with the escalating dread. I grabbed my jacket, zipped up against the creeping dawn cold, and stepped out, the door clicking shut behind me. A resonating sound that seemed to signal more than just the end of my shift. The street was unnaturally quiet, like the taut breath before a storm, and my footsteps echoed against the narrow alleyways leading away from the diner. Frost edged the corners of littered newspapers and discarded coffee cups, gleaming faintly under the weak glow of the street lamp. As I trudged along, the strange quiet felt oppressive, looming over me like a leaden sky. I reached the corner where the solemn red stoplight blinked a dull, incessant beat. Not a car in sight. Normally, I'd relish the solitude, the time alone to reorder my thoughts after a chaotic night shift. But that clicking of the door, sealing off the diner, that safe haven, and pushing me into the brisk morning made everything seem wrong today. It was a feeling I couldn't shake off, as if I were walking right into an unseen web. The faded yellow line on the road invited me onward with a cold, indifferent guideline. Shoving my hands deeper into my jacket pockets, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched and focused on the rhythmic tapping of a distant hammer, construction, maybe, or an early bird settling into their day's work. It was difficult to tell with the echo wrapping the sound in a distorted envelope. As I passed Mrs. Molina's bakery, a promise of warmth and cinnamon wafted out through the barely ajar door. Almost instinctively, I drew closer but stopped midway. The smell was right but skewed, accompanied by an inexplicable undertone of something charred. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as my hand hovered over the door handle. Mrs. Molina never opened this early. My heart thumped loudly, my breath visible, making small clouds in the chill. Was it the leftover anxiety from work, or something more? With a dry swallow, I continued on, leaving the bakery door untested. Maybe I should have checked inside, made sure everything was in order. But that smell, it wasn't right. Shaking off the inexplicable dread, I picked up my pace, eager to get home, to lock the door behind me and maybe catch a few hours of unrestful but necessary sleep. A backfire disrupted the morning stillness, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just a car. That's what I told myself despite the shiver that crawled up my spine. This day demanded vigilance, an intensity that weighed down my limbs and dragged at my steps. Then something shifted in the periphery of my vision. A flicker, so subtle it could have been a trick of my sleep-deprived brain. But when I turned, it was there, something small and dark darting between the garbage bins across the street. A cat, possibly, but the way it moved seemed wrong. Its shape was distorted, limping and erratic. I couldn't tear my eyes away, caught in the surreal dance of the creature's silhouetted form against the pre-dawn light. Suddenly it stopped and seemed to look right at me. The animal, or whatever it was, gave a low, guttural moan, so filled with pain and anger that it gripped my chest tight with fear. My first instinct was to run, but my legs disobeyed, rooted to the spot by a morbid fascination. What was wrong with it? Why did its presence taint the air with a prickling sense of dread? Realizing I was holding my breath, I let it out slowly, trying to regain some semblance of calm. It was just an animal, hurt perhaps. But as I took a step toward it, a desire to help overcoming my fear, it scuttled away into the shadows, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. How did it look at me like that? Was it really looking at me? The rest of the walk was a blur of dark shapes and ominous silences. My apartment building greeted me with the familiar buzz of the faulty neon sign that flickered in the lobby. As I pushed through the door, the sensation of invisible eyes on my back didn't dissipate, but instead seemed to follow me inside. I hurried up the stairs, each footstep ringing louder than usual. When I reached my door, it was with a trembling hand that I fumbled for the keys, dropped them, then finally managed to shove the door open and stumble inside. Safe, but for how long? The question, once raised, couldn't be unthought. My thoughts raced with unreasonable, yet unstoppable scenarios. A form waiting in the dark, an unnatural creature crawling from the shadows. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, the smell of the bakery's mingled warmth and char filling my senses in an unsettling memory. Sleep was a distant hope now, replaced by jittery vigilance. The apartment felt smaller somehow, constrictive, as if it tightened around me. And then the silence was broken, a whisper, or perhaps a hiss from just outside the window. I froze, listening, straining over the pounding of my own heart. Imagination, exhaustion, or something else? The street lay empty now, or so it seemed, bathed in the eerie half-light of dawn that knew things I could not, understand. And still I listened, the feeling of being watched growing heavier with each passing second. And still I listened, the feeling of being watched growing heavier with each passing second. My breaths hitched to the rhythm of my pounding heart as the house seemed to settle deeper into its foundations, groaning with age and secrets. The whispers inside the walls had quieted, but that silence was almost worse, ominous, expecting. I edged toward the kitchen, the familiar creak of the third floorboard from the living room door seeming to scream under my weight. The fluorescent light flickered as I entered, casting sickly shadows that danced across the dingy tiles. A part of me, a very foolish part, wondered if the flickering was Morse code, if the house was trying to communicate its dark secrets. But I shook the thought away, focusing instead on filling the kettle at the sink, watching the stream of water as if it could wash away the crawling dread up my spine. Every subtle sound was magnified, a testament to the eerie stillness of the night. The whistle of the kettle seemed to scream a warning as it boiled, and I fumbled with it, almost dropping the scalding pot. The slight burn on my palm felt oddly grounding, shocking my senses back from their spiraling paranoia. Yet the relief was short-lived. Steam rose in ghost-like whirls, and I fancied I saw faces within them, twisted, pleading expressions that vanished as quickly as they appeared. My heart skipped as I poured the steaming water into my mug, the herb's aroma failing to comfort me. What had been a sanctuary felt slowly like a trap, the air thick with something unspoken. I headed back towards the living room, mug in hand, trying to shake off the unease. But the moment I stepped in, the air shifted, static, charged with a palpable tension. The old grandfather clock ticked loudly, more commanding with each talk. Drawn inexplicably toward it, I noticed for the first time how the wood around its face was darker, stained by time perhaps, or something else. As I was considering this anomaly, the floorboard by the fireplace emitted a pronounced groan. Instinctively, I whipped around. The mantelpiece was barren save for an old photograph of the house, taken seemingly a century ago. Yet tonight, it seemed different. Were there always two windows on the second floor in the photograph? My pulse hammered in my ears as I leaned closer, the glass of the frame cold and slightly vibrating under my fingertips. Then I saw it. A shadow flickered at one of the upper windows in the photograph, as though something had moved. I recoiled, my back hitting the wall, the cold seeping through my clothes. The room felt smaller, the walls nudging closer with each of my ragged breaths. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied, but the damage was done. My eyes darted around, half expecting shadows to detach from the corners and come creeping toward me. It was then that I heard it, a low, mournful sobbing from upstairs. The sound was so laden with grief it rooted me to the spot, my own sorrow mingling with that echoing despair. It ceased as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by a heavy silence that felt like an omen. Dread pooled in my stomach as I toyed with the idea of fleeing the house. But the sobbing resumed, louder, closer, as though just outside the living room door. Fear glued me to the spot, the cup trembling in my grip until it clattered to the floor, breaking the silence with its shatter. Frozen, I barely breathed, listening as soft footsteps approached. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, more forbidding. They stopped just on the other side of the door, then silence, excruciating silence. My mind raced with horrific possibilities of what lay beyond that barrier of wood and uncertainty. Tears stung my eyes, the cold seeping into my bones as I imagined all the lives this house must have consumed, the memories ingrained in its walls, slowly driving its inhabitants to despair. I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the overwhelming terror. Then the doorknob turned slowly, excruciatingly. As it opened, the hinges whimpering under the strain, I shut my eyes, unprepared to face whatever horror lay beyond. A dry, cold gust emanated from the widening gap between the door and its frame, carrying with it the stale scent of old wood and something else, mustier, like damp earth after a heavy rain. Pressure pressed on my ears as though I'd plunged deep underwater, a silence so dense that my own heartbeat roared like thunder. Then, an eye met mine through the thin slit, a pale, unblinking eye that seemed to float in the shadow beyond. I flinched away, my back crashing into the opposite wall of my narrow hallway, but the door continued to open, creaking mournfully. The thing in the doorway filled the space, tall and lean, wrapped in numerous layers of dark, tattered cloth that hung off its skeletal frame like damp funeral drapes. A hood obscured its face, but from the depths, two pale eyes shone with a hungry light. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The presence itself was enough to steal the breath from my lungs, turning my legs to brittle, trembling sticks. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind fueled by too many nights feasting on horror novels and eerie podcasts. It had to be. The rational part of me screamed to run, to push past it and escape, but fear rooted me in place. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, it extended a hand, an appendage more akin to clawed branches than human fingers, skeletal and covered in a skin as pale and translucent as moth wings. It reached for me not with haste, but with inevitability. I felt a scream building in my chest, but it clung to my ribs, unwilling or unable to escape. By some miracle, my paralysis broke, and I stumbled backward, my limbs reanimated by sheer survival instinct. I nearly tripped over my own feet as I turned and ran for the kitchen, the only place I could think to barricade myself. The house groaned under the weight of its uninvited guest, the sound of its movement, a barely perceptible shuffling, like dried leaves dragged along pavement. My breaths came out in ragged gasps as I heaved the heavy kitchen table up against the door, stacking chairs on top in a fit of desperate energy. But even as I created my fortress, doubt gnawed at me. What good were wooden chairs against something that seemed to breathe calamity? I turned to face the room, searching for anything else I could use as a weapon. My gaze landed on the knives on the magnetic strip, the metal gleaming dimly in the flickering light of the bulb overhead. Grabbing the largest chef's knife, I tried to steady my shaking hand, the steel feeling far too light to be of any real use. Then I heard it, the soft, scraping sound of cloth against the hallway floor drifting towards the kitchen. The noises paused at my makeshift barrier, and a silence fell, more suffocating than before. I tightened my grip on the knife, every muscle coiled like a spring, every sense straining against the quiet. A tap against the wood, then another. It wasn't forceful, rather it was curious, almost polite. But behind each gentle knock was an unspoken threat, the promise of something inexorable. The knocks continued, a slow, methodical rhythm that seemed to be counting down to an inevitable conclusion. I could hardly bear to breathe, my eyes fixed on the door, the knife's edge slick with fearful sweat. The knocking ceased, and what followed was a whisper, no louder than a sigh, but clear in the terrifying silence. My name, uttered so tenderly, so familiarly, as though from a lover's lips. Panic flared raw and bright within me, the implication far worse than any blow could be. This horror knew me, knew me asterisk, not just where I lived. How many nights had it watched, listened, lingered at the edge of my awareness? A memory clawed up, unbidden, a shadow at my window last week, dismissed as a trick of tired eyes. My hands trembled anew with the reality. Hiding was not enough. Understanding was impossible. Escape, necessary but daunting. The whisper came again, a beckoning full of dark allure, the voice dripping with an obscene sweetness that turned my stomach. Come out, asterisk, it crooned, as if this were no more than a game of hide and seek with darkness itself. It was then, in the gnawing silence that followed, I realized the true horror was not just in being hunted, but in being wanted by an abyss that knew my name and whispered it with such human longing.